Rudolph Giuliani, who has been evident today, which reminds me that Claire Shipman in Washington has been with us all day, watching the president come and go here and there. Claire, how do you think he's been affected by this day? And I realize that's asking you to be a bit of a mind reader.
Well, I think you can read it on his face to some extent, Peter. It's incredibly serious. He and Mrs. Bush, I think, have both been at times visibly moved, especially greeting the families of the victims in Pennsylvania. Those moments, advisors say, are always very emotional for him. And I think he's a man who has gone through so many changes in this last year. I mean, you see it in his hair. His hair is grayer. And I think you also see it in the way for a while, his moral clarity, which is a natural state for the president, seemed to line up with the world's moral clarity. But I think what will be interesting to watch is the world has moved on to some extent. It's a murkier place again. Decision about going to war in Iraq is a very difficult one, and it will be interesting to see how the president adapts to that change.
It is certainly true that the president sees the world in very clear, distinct terms in this regard. You know, Washington changed so much a year ago. What effect do you think this day might have on official Washington, if any?
Well, I think it will remind everybody in official Washington of a brief moment where there was so much less focus on the truly trivial in terms of partisan politics here. And it went on for a couple of months. And to some extent, partisan politics, Peter, have returned here. But one thing is interesting. The partisan politics that exist now are about more substantive issues. They're about the war in Iraq. They're about budget issues. You don't see the sort of personal animosity that you felt before last September 11th. And I think this year will be another reminder that people like the change.
George Stephanopoulos is also with us, watching from his post in Washington. We're just simply waiting for the president to show up at Ground Zero in a short motorcade from the Wall Street heliport. George, I'm one of those in favor of partisan politics because that's what makes democracy go round. Do you think we'll see more of it in the year ahead?
Well, we started to see a lot over the course of the last year, Peter, coming as we entered actually into 2002. And yes, I think I do. You saw, look at the difference yesterday. The administration went up to Capitol Hill to brief, to give evidence they have about Saddam Hussein's efforts to build weapons of mass destruction, to build nuclear weapons. And the difference between the Republican and Democratic senators coming out of that briefing was very, very stark. The Republicans basically said that they've now seen the evidence they think they need to see. They want to hear the president's speech, but they're basically on the road towards approving the course that the president was going to take. Democratic senators like Richard Durbin of Illinois and others came out and said, I didn't see anything new. I have to be convinced. So yes, I do think you're going to see more partisan disagreement. You also hear from some Democrats, Peter, in the last few days, some skepticism about the timing of this talk about now action against Iraq, suggesting that perhaps it's a little bit too close to Election Day. Why now? Why are we seeing this push now?
George, this is a hugely popular president still, as we've said several times today, and was, when we think back a year ago, I think almost by universal agreement, the absolutely appropriate person to lead the nation at this moment of huge and enormous stress. But I sense a reluctance, certainly in the Democratic Party and in some wings of the Republican Party, to take the president on in foreign policy. Are they just intimidated by his popularity?
I think that's part of it, Peter. I think the second part of that is that they just don't want this debate to be about foreign policy, national security policy. That's traditionally the Republican strength. The Democrats would much more want the election debate to be about corporate irresponsibility and the economic insecurity. But you're right about the president's popularity. He's had the longest sustained high approval ratings of any president since polls have been taken. And that's been a big, big cushion for the president over the last year.
Thanks very much, George. And Claire in Washington. The president now arriving in New York, as I said, when he came that time and got up, you'll recall, with the firemen, grabbed the bullhorn and talked to all of the people. It was like an injection of enthusiasm and energy into people who were deeply and profoundly stressed here. And this city particularly got a lot of it from Rudolph Giuliani. And you can't be in New York without being sensitive to the fact that this is a more continuingly big part of life than it has been in other parts of the country. You listen to reporting other parts of the country these days, and people are indeed more interested in prescription drugs, taxes, state of the economy. We've tried to cover most of them today, though we haven't done prescription drugs. As the President arrives, I want to introduce two other people here with me in New York. Terry Moran, who's our White House correspondent, and Nikki Stern, whose husband, James Patorti, died in the World Trade Center a year ago today, and Nikki has very kindly given of her time. She's become a very significant spokesperson on behalf of the victims' families. Do you just hate that phrase, victims' families?
I'm not sure what else we can say,
Yeah.
but it's getting a little tiring. Survivors.
Survivors. I'm very interested to hear that your diary, or portions of your diary, are in that Smithsonian exhibition.
Yes.
Can you share some of what you wrote in it?
I have the first paragraph memorized because it was a little shocking, because I was not in New York that day. I normally would be on a Tuesday. And I was in a supermarket, and the clerk ran down the aisle yelling, "The World Trade Center's been hit by a plane." And I was holding a carton of eggs and remember thinking to drop the eggs would be too melodramatic. So I walked very slowly to the checkout counter, paid for the eggs, and walked out the door, and then ran to the car and went crazy and went home and turned on the television and tried to count the floors from the bottom from the top, and then saw the second plane hit the second tower.
As I said, you've become very involved in survivors' rights. How do you think, is a government issue as much as anything else, how do you think governments, New York City, New Jersey, New York, the federal government, how do you think they're doing for you all?
I think it's better. I think that there is endemic to governments and private organizations layers of bureaucracy that tend to get in the way of sincere outreach. And for people in trauma, it's very exacerbating to have to deal with paperwork and forms and multiple death certificates. That's been kind of a challenge for everyone the last year.
As you know, I was talking to the master of the Victims' Compensation Fund earlier today. Somebody told me you had not been entirely happy with his approach.
Oh, I don't know who told you that. I think that he's become more sensitized to the families.
He agreed.
But I think initially there was some real contention because he had some. It was a delivery style as much as anything. It rubbed some families the wrong way.
Yeah, all of us, you know, who do this as reporters and editors and stuff, do today and covered the last thing, we very often feel like voyeurs. What has today meant to you and the other survivors that you're aware of? Has this been a good day? Has this been an important day?
That's an excellent question. I sometimes think that the voyeurs, or what we call the outsiders, frankly, might think that this is a door through which you walk on September 11th, and that on the 12th, everything is clearer. You have closure. And of course, when you have so many people not identified or only slightly identified and not much collected, and you have the mental health issues, some of which the children talked about going forward, and you have people that are still numb, it's an ongoing process. And you have big picture issues that are potentially positive, but that we haven't, as a country, really talked about yet.
And of course, we all have to appreciate and be aware that you can't generalize.
No.
I mean, many survivors didn't attend the ceremonies today, and a lot of people said the last thing in the world they want to do is watch television. They'd go to the woods instead.
Yeah.
It's just too hard for some survivors to be in public, I assume.
Absolutely. I'm bringing 17 widows and mothers to Ground Zero next week from New Jersey because they just couldn't come today, but they need to go. But they couldn't come with all of the ceremony, and they couldn't mark this day that way.
Do you know anybody who hasn't been to Ground Zero?
Yes.
Oh, really? Never?
Yes,
Really?
yes. Probably half of the people that I'm bringing next week.
Have not been at all. I don't mean just
all.
on the anniversary, but not been at all.
At all.
Because other families felt it was so important to be there because they regarded this as hallowed ground. It was like going to a cemetery.
The people you hear from are the people who are able to voice their opinions and get up and go out. And there are a huge number of people that don't fall into that category.
You were one of the people who was reading some of the names today. It took about, as I recall, about 45 minutes to an hour longer than we'd anticipated.
Well, not longer than I anticipated, but yeah, it was long. It was a long day.
And of the names you read, did you know?
Yes, I knew two of the people. And I actually emailed in one case, a wife, and in a widow, and the other case, parents, and said, I'm reading their names.
It's fair, I think, to describe you, as we wait for the president to come here to Ground Zero, it's fair, I think, to describe you as an activist. I mean that in the best sense.
Advocate.
Activist. People are getting through this in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. Some, I assume, in absolute privacy.
Yeah.
Others of you by being very active.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, I had no children, and Jim really was, for better, for worse, my whole life.
You were married for 13 years, right?
11, but I knew him for 13. And I had to do something. I felt very isolated. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, although I work in New York. And I found I was able to get information. And then I found there were people that needed it. And then I found there was a reason for me to get up in the morning, which was to get the information to the people that needed it. And I guess that's how I became an activist. And I worked for architects, and so there was something I could do in terms of contributing to the future of Ground Zero.
Are you generally pleased, if not with the, because we haven't never got close to final designs for memorials or rebuilding the trains, but do you think the public generally, the government, the public, everybody's involved, is doing it in a kind and responsible way?
I think they've been very considerate of the families. I'm aware, as an advocate, if you will, that there are other stakeholders involved, and I have early on been interested in hearing their opinion. It's difficult for the families, and I see myself as a translator. We need to hear from other people.
It's sometimes said that the families have inordinate power. Now, I don't mean too much, but I mean unusual power in almost every instance.
Well, I think it's also important to realize, at least when you're talking about Ground Zero, that the families themselves have differences. And there are many of us that realize and that feel a responsibility to come to a consensus with the other stakeholders. I know that that my husband was a great lover of life and was very aware of the residents and the small businesses and other things going on down there that need to be accommodated.
As I said, we're waiting for the president. Can I just ask you one last question?
Sure.
Chair Moran and I are just sitting here fascinated. People like us ask you all the time, tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. Do you mind?
No. I fell in love with Jim and he with me. And I saw him at a party and it was love at first sight. But I had to borrow an apartment in Paris to get him to fall in love with me because he was kind of a reluctant bridegroom. So I was a cabaret singer in my other life, and I had a friend who was a cabaret owner who owned an apartment in Montmartre, of all the romantic places to go. And I borrowed it, and I invited Jim. I got a rent rebate that summer, and off we went to Paris. I mean, it was just a love story, just a love story.
Well, we're very grateful to you for giving us the time.
Thank you.
Sharing some of yourself, it's not easy.
No.
Not easy to listen to you either.
I'm sorry.
We're expecting President Bush momentarily to do something official. We know he is here. Terry Moran, I apologize for ignoring you, but we want to tell our stations along the line that we know that some of you on the East Coast may leave us for local news. We will continue. Thank you for joining us up until now. I'm Peter Jennings. Our coverage of this anniversary continues, and we're very grateful to Nikki Stern, whose husband died at the World Trade Center, for coming and talking to us for a while. Her diary, or excerpts from her diary, at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington. If you were not with us earlier, there is a very moving exhibition at the Smithsonian, and Michelle Norris, our correspondent, told us today that it's the largest attendance they've ever had at an opening. And it seems to make sense today. The President and Mrs. Bush down the ramp into the pit towards the Circle of Honor. As you can see, the ramp, and that's just exactly what it is flanked. President and Mrs. Bush's walk can't be an easy walk to make, flanked by members of all of the services and organizations, city, state, federal, who have worked here for the last year. And we recognize that we've lingered on this site longer today than we have in a year, and it looks so extraordinarily different to people. It has gone through so many phases. Somebody, I've forgotten whom, is keeping a moment-by-moment pictorial record, and will also keep one of the rebuilding of whatever it is here. We're talking about 16 acres of land. A year ago, we had no idea whether or not the magnitude of it was, you could capture it on television, and those of us who went to visit it shortly after realized, of course, you couldn't. It's a long walk for the President and Mrs. Bush. Terry Moran, our White House correspondent. Thoughts?
Listening to Nikki Stern, imagine being the president and having 3,000 of those stories weigh on your responsibilities. We know from Mr. Bush's own comments that he feels naturally an obligation to the loss. He carries with him, and it's in the Oval Office all the time, the badge of George Howard, the Port Authority police officer whose mother gave it to Mr. Bush, and it's a serious totem for him as he carries out his duties.
And I think you're the one who said earlier, I think you said it before, it's transformed his presidency. Finally, a moment of noise down there.
People ask a lot, how has it changed him? He's a lot more powerful.
Just catch a glimpse of that presidential plaque. It has the presidential seal in it. And on the plaque it says, every life taken here, every act of valor performed here, the nation holds an honored memory. And for the third time today, the President and Mrs. Bush spend time with the families. I wanted to read you something which I read in a